Hello, everyone. A very good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on the time you are listening to my talk, which is titled Can Faith Focused Materials Defeat the COVID-19 Burnouts of EFL Learners? Thoughts on Pedagogy and Materials. My name is Mahmudul. I'm an assistant professor of English in the Department of English and Humanities, BRAC University. So, how it all started, as you know, that pandemic has changed everything. Every day we are hearing news of deaths and also corona-induced illnesses, which affected our lives big times. So after the pandemic, my EFL classes on Zoom turned somber and serious, became unusually quiet and zero communicative. Of course, the rate of student absence increased. My students responded to even my greetings very reluctantly. At times, there was no response at all. My voice was the only voice that I could hear in my class. Not a single student asked a question. And I had a feeling that students were waiting for the class to be over. How did I feel? Well, how could I feel? Of course, I felt extremely frustrated, highly demotivated, very much bored, and I felt like a lecturer. I did not, see myself as a facilitator anymore, like someone who just gives a lecture, who does not make the class interactive and engaging. But I had to do something about it. Now, what did I do? Well, I started the class as usual with warm greetings, but this time I tried to do something different. How? Well, previously I used to greet my students and then moved on to start my lesson. But this time I greeted my students and then I waited for their answers. Sometimes there was no response, there was no answer with the first greeting. And then I greeted them again and sort of, forced them to respond, because I think this is kind of ice breaking, which would, urge my learners to wake up. And then, a few responses, not all of them responded, a few responses. Then I gave a small talk on pandemic safety measures. That was kind of a routine, thing I used to do as a part of my social responsibility. Then I shared a recent issue, which was quite lighthearted and humorous. For example, one day I told them that in one of my classes, in the first 15 minutes, I spoke quite passionately. But then I realized that I was muted. That means my students didn't hear a single word, but none of my students said anything, right? I think they were too passive and bored to even speak up. And then I began the lesson with a question based on the lesson, of course, followed by examples, fun examples to illustrate a given point related to the lesson. I used to divide the students into breakout rooms to engage them with a pedagogic task. And finally, after they were done with the task, they had to make brief presentations based on whatever activities or tasks that they did. Now, let me talk about the lesson itself. Now, the name of the lesson is What is Next? Number of students 18. Proficiency level intermediate, skills focused, writing and speaking. Step 1. Now, after I greeted my students and after the small talk was over, I asked them if they had ever eaten dinner at a restaurant. The answer was, of course, a yes. And then I asked them two questions. What did they eat, right? And did they leave any tips for the waiter? Now, these are the questions as I already told you, I asked them first, I greeted them and then waited for their answer. And then I shared something funny with them. So these are all my baby steps to sort of wake the class up. After that, I told them a fictitious story, about my having dinner at a restaurant. So I told them that the night before the lockdown, I had my dinner at a restaurant. And then I asked if my students could guess what I did at the restaurant. Some typical answers were, well, you walked into the restaurant, you ordered food and ate them, you paid the bill and left. What else? That is what people do, right? So this is what we know from our world knowledge. Here is the twist. I told them that their first two guesses were right. However, the third one was not, as I did something pretty unusual. I did not pay the bill. Instead, I threatened the manager on gunpoint to hand me all the money from the cash box and quickly left the restaurant. My students had a good laugh with the unorthodox example. They liked it a lot, by the way. In step two, I divided the class into 6 breakout rooms. Each of the groups consisted of 3 students. I distributed information gap sheets among all the groups, which contained the first 2 sentences of a story of an unusual pandemic incident. And the task of the students was to complete the story with their group members. Here are 2 examples. Now, example 1. During a lockdown, you are craving for chicken roll and a small restaurant next to your house is secretly open, closing its front shutter, but they do not do home delivery. You cannot make up your mind what to do, and then something unusual happens. Example 2. During a lockdown, you need to go to a dentist to receive treatment for a severe toothache. But as you are halfway through your way, you realize that you forgot your mask. When you cannot decide whether to go back home to bring your mask or to go to the dentist, something unusual happens. So you see that they have to continue the story with their group members. Then step 3, each of the groups received a sample situation and brainstormed with their group members about a possible unusual incident, right? And then they have to write a complete paragraph briefly describing the unusual incident and wrap up the story with a proper conclusion. The possible total number of sentences should be between 5 to 6. The allotted time for each of the groups is 10 minutes. Step 4, as they're back to the main window, each of the groups will make a short presentation in which they will read aloud their story and will explain how they constructed it. They will be encouraged to embellish it with real-life details. Now, this lesson was quite successful, and some of the student responses were, well, the task was quite engaging. We liked it. There are opportunities for creative brainstorming. The group discussion time was quite enjoyable, and the task was pretty helpful for us to forget the grim reality of the pandemic for a while. Here comes an end to my presentation, everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you found this useful and maybe you can try this in your class. Thank you very much.